And I would like to welcome you to the forum based on the Bill Gates book on how to avoid the climate disaster. The solutions that we have and the breakthroughs that we need presented and by our organization in conjunction with the Eco-Modernist Society of North America and the Seattle Friends of Fission. I want to thank Carl Pauls. Already had the pleasure of meeting Carl, and my highest regard. Rick Maltesi, Kurt Smith Peters, Victoria Olson, our colleague at the Labor Community Alliance, Joyce Maggie, and Christopher Bergen, as well as our panelists, Scott Montgomery, Meredith Angwin, George Erickson, and the chair of our LCA Environmental Committee, an almost neighbor of mine, my brother Gabe Ignetti, who will give us a very short synopsis of the book. Gabe, all yours.
Yes. Hi, everybody. My name is Gabe Ignetti, as Lorenzo said, and I'm here on behalf of the Eco-Modernist Society of North America. We are an activist organization that aspires to build a new science-based environmentalism 2.0. For those of you who don't know about eco-modernism, it is basically the belief that rather than retreating from modernity, our ecological problems can be only solved by the exponential advance of scientific progress in the service of humanity. So I want to welcome you all to the forum, and we're going to go to the slideshow right here and show you what this is about. Okay? This forum is not the last word, but rather the starting point to understanding the depth of our problem and the challenges that we face, the advances that we need to make, and the things we need to do to alleviate as best we can our climate crisis. I want to start by giving you a quick synopsis of the book. To begin with, the book gives a good point of comparison as to the depths of the emerging climate crisis. According to Bill Gates, the climate change could be as deadly as COVID by 2050, and by 2100, 5 times worse. So, Bill Gates starts with 5 questions to ask in every climate conversation, which serves as a guide to give us some context. So we have number 1. How much is 51 billion tons of carbon? That is the amount of carbon that we put in the world annually. It should be the metric on which we base our progress and judge the efficacy. What is your plan for cement? Manufacturing of steel and cement and many other common products requires extremely high heat that has evaded clean energy solutions and necessitated the use of massive amounts of fossil fuels. Now, the production of cement and steel represents 10% of our emissions. Manufacturing plastic, steel and cement, we put the 3 together, is 31%. Electricity, 27%. Agriculture, 19%. Transportation, 16%. Cooling and heating, 7%. How much power are we talking about? It is important that we understand what kilowatts, megawatts, and gigawatts means in the real life terms. In general, they are measures of how much power we need to run things. And you can see the world is 5,000 gigawatts, USA, 1,000. Major cities, more or less 10. New York City requires 12, so the bigger ones require more. Mid-sized cities, 1 gigawatt, and small towns is 1 megawatt, and then we go down to your house, which is 1 gigawatt. So how much space do you need? That's a very important question. Energy sources per square meter from the most to the least are fossil fuels, nuclear, solar, hydro, wind, and biomass. And the lower we go in the totem pole, the more land use and often habitat destruction is involved. Our energy density generally means more material is used to build your electric facility, not including fuel, which is extremely small to non-existent for clean energy sources. Fuel is not the only factor here, though. Which brings us to capacity factor. which is the percent of time that your power source is producing your wattage. And lastly, intermittency, in the case of wind and solar, which is weather dependent. And Bill Gates proposes to fill the inevitable gap caused by intermittency by electricity supply by building high voltage transmission lines. But he confesses that the political hurdles, including environmental damage, would be daunting. He also states that remaining energy gaps would have to be filled by gas plants with carbon capture and storage, along with nuclear power. He points out that nuclear simply is not dangerous compared to other energy sources if you count deaths caused by unit of electricity, and that its existing problems could be overcome by the development of advanced reactors. How much is it going to cost? We can't overlook economics. The root of the problem is that because of their abundance and easy transit, fossil fuels are way too inexpensive. Now, oil is less expensive than Coca-Cola. If the exact same energy from oil were $3 a gallon and the exact same amount was $2, then the difference would be $1. That's known as the green premium. The green premium usually works against us because we all pay the hidden costs in terms of air pollution, climate disruption, and ocean acidification. In short, profits are privatized and destructive outcomes are socialized. This injustice can only be rectified by putting a price on carbon, which is both necessary but extremely unpopular. But it could go negative if you are buying a solar hot water heater or heat pumps. Then you save money. Okay, so that's an advantage, actually. We can see here that traveling less is not a solution to our problem. It can help, but unfortunately, personal sacrifice simply doesn't come close to solving the problem. The economic slowdown eased carbon emissions by approximately 5%, but this illustrates that if we stop driving, it wouldn't really do very much. When we consider that 860 million people, including roughly half of sub-Saharan Africa, don't have reliable access to electricity, we have to realize that we cannot and should not stop people from advancing or using energy. The real solution must be to supply them with inexpensive, clean energy, thus reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero. And that's what this forum is all about. And so I will now pass the baton to Carl Pauls for Seattle Friends of Fission, who will present our panelists. And thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Gabe. So we're going to hear from Meredith Angwin, George Erickson, and Scott Montgomery. Meredith is a retired chemist who headed projects that lowered pollution and increased reliability on the electricity grid. Her work included pollution control for nitrogen oxides in gas-fired combustion turbines and corrosion control in geothermal and nuclear systems. Her latest book is Shorting the Grid, The Hidden Fragility of Our Electric Grid. George Erickson is a member of the National Center for Science Education, a past vice president of the American Humanist Association, a past president of the Minnesota Humanists. He is the author of Unintended Consequences, The Lie That Killed Millions and Accelerated Climate Change. Scott Montgomery is an author, geoscientist, and affiliate faculty member in the Jackson School of International Studies, University of Washington. He writes and lectures on many topics related to energy, geopolitics, technology, resources, climate change, American politics, intellectual history, language and communication, and the history of science. He is a frequent contributor to online journals. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Meredith, who is our first speaker. Meredith.
Yes, I will start my presentation. I read Gates' book, and I really felt it was a significant book and brought out a lot of important issues that are usually sort of swept under the rug. We can even look at what Gabe presented and the pie chart of what percentage from all the different sources. I mean, hearing things in the press, you get the impression that the electric grid is the most significant cause of carbon emissions, but actually it is about 27%. It's about a quarter of them. So I think that it's really good that Gates wrote this book. A friend of mine, Bob Hargraves, wrote a book, Electrify Everything, which is similar. But the thing is, nobody knows Bob necessarily. So I think that there's something important to having the kind of platform that Bill Gates has and writing a book like this. So I went through the book. I had some things that I thought were just terrific about it. One of them is the whole idea of the green premium calculation concept. The first time I saw the green premium, it was at a meeting of a local group that I was a member of the coordinating committee for, and that was the consumer liaison group for my grid operator. A man was giving a presentation on cost of compliance with green with the renewable portfolio standard requirements. You don't usually see that. I mean, people don't usually go like, oh, and here's the cost of compliance. And I thought that the green premium is really a good calculation concept. It's similar to cost of compliance, but more general. It isn't just about renewable portfolio standards. Another excellent thing is looking at all sectors in the book. He doesn't hesitate to look at the tough ones like agriculture. I mean, I think agriculture is really, I don't know that can be solved. I know that within the context of this meeting, we have to say, oh, we have to do everything all at once. My own feeling is always gradualism. If we could solve all the others and agriculture was left, we'd be in pretty good shape compared to now. So that's how I look at it. And he points out, why Paul Ehrlich expected massive starvation by 1980. And why was he wrong? Because of fertilizers and plants that were developed to take advantage of the fertilizers. And one of my favorite sections of the book is that just a sentence is on page 196. And when he says partial reductions by 2030 could set us on the wrong path for 2050. And that is so important because, you see all this stuff like, well, we changed the coal for gas. Well, the gas plant is going to be there for many years because they don't take down big infrastructure easily. And so what I'm saying is that maybe changing the coal for nuclear might have not gotten us to the same thing by 2030 because they're slower to build, but might be a lot better for the path for 2050. So here's some of the things that are not good, I felt. First of all, I have to acknowledge that he explains a lot and he can't explain everything. I know that's certainly true of the book I just wrote. I'm like, oh, there are things I left out, big things. But if you're not trying to write a 2,000-page book, you leave things out. He also doesn't understand the institutional issues. A lot of these things are about how we can do it. Well, that's good. Everybody should know that. But for example, it takes decades to get permission for a new transmission line in the United States. So if he says, well, we'll fill in the gaps with transmission, I'm going like, I don't think so. But here's what I call the annoying, and other people may say, oh, this is just you, Meredith, but I don't think it's fair to write things and not back them up. I admit it that shorting the grid has 300 endnotes, and I think that may be extreme, and I get it. But nevertheless, Gates makes assertions, and I don't know where they're coming from. For example, he, on page 58, and Gabe showed this table, nuclear generates less power per square meter than fossil fuels. I was really surprised at that. Nuclear is a very dense source of power. And I was like, well, which fossil fuels? If you're comparing it to coal, that is so wrong. Similarly, had a statement that the growing season in Africa will shrink with global warming on page 63. No reference. Well, it will in some places, but it won't in other places. Africa stretches between one Mediterranean climate on the Mediterranean and another Mediterranean climate down at the southern Cape of Africa, and a lot of different climates in between. He has done a lot for Africa in terms of malaria prevention and stuff. But when I see Africa described as just Africa, as if it's just like, oh yeah, if you're one part of Africa, if you've seen one part of Africa, you've seen them all, I get a little distressed. So I really consider that very annoying. And this is a reason why we, as interested people, have to go further and not just say, okay, we've got the Gates book, we're done, we know what's going on. And so here, I'm just finishing up just a picture of my own book, which is about the way our grid is going to a very fragile situation of renewables backed up by just-in-time natural gas. And I also want to say before I finish my little 5-minute or 10-minute talk that I'm going to use these same view graphs in my 15-minute talk later, except that instead of just dashing through with the speed of lightning, I will hope to get some discussion and concern and what people think might be the next steps. It means we have to follow up. We have to expand it. So with that, I am going to close this.
All right. So I wanted to welcome everyone here. Thank you for coming very much. I know you're from different areas of the country. People who are local to Western Washington are enjoying a wonderful day. I'm sure we'll pay for it. Nonetheless, all the magnolias and the cherry trees are out, and it's so you are sacrificing to be with your computer, though you could be outside, granted. So I wanted to thank you for coming. So I am what would be called an energy expert. I spent 25 years in the energy industry, what most of you would probably know as the Great Satan, and that's the oil industry. So I come from the inside of that, but I also come from 20 years of teaching at the University of Washington, courses related to energy and climate change. And that's forced me to go far beyond oil, gas, and coal, and geology as well, into renewables and nuclear and future possibilities. Mr. Gates is someone that I don't know personally, but I know a number of people who he consults. He's a very smart man, Mr. Gates. He does know a lot of people. He talks to them. This is different from just reading what they write. Very important point, because people will say things that they won't write, as we all know. And he has a lot of money, and he has a lot of fame. So a book that he writes is going to get an awful lot of attention. Also, he is a relentless and even furious, I might say, promoter of trying to make the world a better place than it was when he acquired his fortune. And we should thank him for that. The results of that are viewed in different ways. But it's clear that he's had some significant successes as an individual and with his wife through the foundation. This is probably, if we can stomach people having as much money as he has, this is a good way to give it back and to take responsibility for the social and the economic realities that made it possible for him to acquire such a fortune. Needless to say, this is not the case with all people who now have the amount of money of a GDP of a small country, or sometimes a not so small country. In any case, this is an appreciation and a critique of Mr. Gates in his book. I think there are many things to admire, and I think there are things that he missed and he misapplied in some ways. I'm not going to criticize all of his errors. There were some errors He is an outsider to the energy industry, but he does have a lot of access to people who know a great deal. Mr. Gates knows very well what an image like this or a juxtaposition like this, what it really means, and it means in a global sense. There are obvious aspects to this, and there are nuanced ones as well. There are about the same number of people in both of these images. That's an important reality because population is not always the determining factor. Notice that in the upper left, modern energy is not missing. It is just not accessible to a majority of people. Many of these people would like to be closer to the lower right image. And in fact, their countries, lower income and middle income countries, their economies are now emerging at a time when fossil fuels are extraordinarily abundant, more abundant than we ever thought they would be. And climate impacts are beginning in a serious way. So this is a very key historical period that we're talking about right now. And Mr. Gates does have a very deep appreciation for this, and his book explains that, I think, quite well. One thing I would mention about his book is that it is very consciously written for an audience that reaches from high school to grad school and beyond. It is very readable, and he explains a lot of complex realities and some technologies to people who might not have a university degree. This is admirable in its for its own sake. I think some people would feel that he might be simplifying things, but this goes to Einstein's idea that you should simplify things as much as you can, but no more. So he does not oversimplify in most areas. He does in a few. Now, Mr. Gates gets a lot of things right about energy, and I'm going to go through a few of these. So I hope that you'll bear with me on this. He does not get everything, but he gets some very, very crucial parts of the picture. He understands very well that the energy transition, will be long and challenging, difficult, and that continuous innovation will be essential. He understands that technology is essential, and he understands that electricity is the future. More and more things will be electrified. Now, I certainly respect what Meredith said about electricity being only part of the generation of emissions. But if we think about what happens when the grid goes down, a great deal more stops than just our electronics. That will shut a society down. Electricity is the basis for modern existence, for modern life. And our grid is quite fragile. It is in enormous need of maintenance and just upkeep, let alone being upgraded to what is called a smart grid, a grid that would be capable of bringing together renewables, variable intermittent sources with more constant sources. So electricity does deserve, I would argue, a significant amount of attention. And one of the important dimensions is to change transportation over to as much electricity as we can, and then to use other types of fuels, biofuels perhaps, to power the things that electricity will take longer to power, particularly large scale operational, construction, mining, agricultural, and aircraft, also ships perhaps. But those are less important than cars, than light duty vehicles. So electricity will be very key to that. And the more we can use electricity to generate heat, process heat for industry, the better. But he recognizes that this is difficult in certain areas, particularly cement. Basically, you're melting rock to create new rock when it comes to cement. He also understands that renewables and nuclear are both essential and will need to work together. This is becoming more and more apparent to people who are anti-nuclear for a long period of time, but not fully. There is still a significant amount of resistance to nuclear, particularly in the countries that gave it to the world. We're talking about the West. It is not such a source of fear to the same degree in Asia or Russia. There are many countries who do not have nuclear power now who want it. And there are many of us on the scientific side that cheer him for this. He understands governments have to be involved. And no matter how much money they have, and private industry are not going to do it alone. And neither is the grassroots. Grassroots has enormous impact in democracies. But we're talking about governments around the world. And so we're talking about autocracies too, and semi-democracies. You got to have governments behind this. And that's because not only do they have lots of money, but they control major decisions, major policy decisions that have everything to do with energy R&D. Continuous innovation is essential. Governments have to be involved in this and see this as a primary responsibility. Now, that being said, I really admire Mr. Gates for saying this, partly out of self-interest, because I've been saying it for a while too, but I think a lot of people recognize this on the engineering side, but also those of us in international studies, advanced nations, which will stop being the center of emissions, of legacy emissions quite soon, by about 2032. By that time, other portions of the world, the developing countries, which include China and India, they will take over the legacy emissions. That's how fast they have developed. But the advanced nations, with their wealth and their scientific and technical expertise, they have the historical responsibility to innovate, to create new knowledge. This is what they've been doing in various areas, including energy to a certain degree, though they could have done an awful lot more. But that's another subject to discuss later. But we in these countries have a real responsibility for the future, for ourselves, as well as the rest of the world, because we will remain the centers of knowledge production and innovation to a large extent. I do not want to say that the rest of the world will be incapable of this. Not at all, not at all. But we do have a major lead now. And this is a very important reality that Mr. Gates points out. Another thing, again, has to do with emissions. If we are going to handle emissions as a world, Asia has to be involved. China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Pakistan. These are all nations with major emissions problems. And if we don't include those, or if they refuse to participate, then we have a serious problem. And this will lead to to a criticism that I have in a moment. The other thing I really credit Mr. Gates with is his optimism. He says we will do it, and we can do it, and we should do it, and we will do it. But he also admits the timing is uncertain, the timing is urgent, and the timing will be long. And though he does not say this, the suggestion is sitting right there on his shoulder that there will be major climate impacts, that the world will not escape with low-level impacts. They will get very serious. In some parts of the world, they are already serious. On the West Coast, in terms of wildfires, a course I recently taught, this is pretty serious now. Yes, it can get more serious, and hopefully it won't, but we'll have to see.
So thank you very much. There's a lot of great information that Scott has here. So George, if you're available.
Before we begin, I want to first say my appreciation for Meredith and Scott joining up, and I like their comments. I do want to mention that the safety image shown in the introduction is actually a little old. And the safety of nuclear power is even better than that image indicates. And I have the reason for that in my presentation. And then I want to mention something that Meredith, I think, alluded to, this one chart that didn't do justice to nuclear. I think it's very important that we do everything we can to contact Mr. Gates to tell him that the people who originated that chart have admitted it's wrong and have withdrawn it, because that is damaging to the case for nuclear power. So I'm going to leave it in the hands of somebody who is maybe able to get a hold of him. I have not been able to try to influence him, to get him to make known that that chart should be disregarded. I guess I'm ready to talk about my part of this. I wrote this book 3 years ago. It has been updated a year and a half ago and substantially updated this month because climate change is worsening. I want to talk a bit about climate change and the environment, because that's the thrust I think that people need to understand. If they aren't motivated by an understanding of what's at risk, they are not too likely to be concerned about where their electricity comes from. So I make the point when I give presentations that sea level rise is a minor issue compared to the acidification of our oceans that provide 20% of our protein and 50% of our oxygen. And not only that, they're shelled organisms all the way from clams and mollusks all the way down to phytoplankton sequester CO2. I think people need to understand that Australia's Great Barrier Reef, which is an immense ecosystem, is already half dead from ocean warming. And the reefs are the ocean's nurseries. Think of losing 50% of our oxygen and 20% of our protein. Since the Industrial Revolution began, we have added more than 2 trillion tons of carbon dioxide to our atmosphere. 1/3 of that has been absorbed by the oceans, which has already made them more acidic and hostile to shell-bearing organisms. Shell-bearing organisms, all the way down to phytoplankton, need a basic surrounding, slightly basic, not neutral, not acid, slightly basic. And the amount of carbon dioxide we have added has already moved them dangerously close to not surviving. The point is, 2/3 of that carbon dioxide remains to be absorbed. And that's enough to kill the oceans. Now, you'd think we'd be getting serious about this, but we're not. Instead, we're adding 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. And I have no belief that that will decrease, given people's disinterest and the fact that our legislators don't do the science. They think jobs and money. Here's an example. On the left, we see healthy phytoplankton. And on the right are phytoplankton that are not forming properly because they are in waters that is less alkaline than it should be. It is getting more towards acidic. The oyster farmers off the coast of Washington, I'm sure that Scott knows about this, have had to add let's say tums, it's equivalent to the tanks of ocean water in which they grow oysters. They found their output decreasing. When they corrected the pH of the water, the output returned. These are not just theoretical things, they are real. I have a friend who lives to scuba dive. He has scuba dived at most of the popular sites worldwide, and he is thinking of giving it up because of what he sees now compared to what he saw just 15 years ago. Birds Ask the Audubon Society about bird populations that are decreasing in the United States. Fish are moving north from the equatorial regions because when water warms, it cannot hold as much oxygen as cold water. And that, of course, is going to have effect on the fish farther north. Speaking of the north, I think we all know that the Arctic ice is melting, gives the polar bears less time on the ice to kill seals, to fatten up, to make it over the summer. Unfortunately, with a shrinking ice pack, many bears are coming off the pack starving, often too weak to make a 50-mile swim to shore, which would have been at one time easy, and they are dying. You'll read reports now and then, oh, they're doing great over there. Well, the Arctic's a big place, and there are going to be locales when they do all right. But in general, they are in trouble. Some people will say, well, that's great for the seals. No, it isn't, because seals have to get on ice to deliver the pups. They're going to have to come ashore to deliver the pups. And then they are attacked by other predators, foxes, wolves, grizzly bears that are moving north because of global warming. Okay, I would like to recommend that everybody watch the NOVA BBC program, Extinctions, The Facts, which is presented by David Attenborough. And when you see it, you'll realize that David is aging like, I guess, pretty much the rest of us. So I have benefited hugely from the people, the professionals of many occupations in the Thorium Energy Alliance. And among those are engineers. And I love their critical analytical thinking. And one of the things that I have learned to do that I did not know when I started out, we must start thinking in footprint of everything. You start with shovel in the ground, and you calculate the environmental costs all the way from mining and refining the material, building and operating the facility, all the way through decommissioning after 60 years of use per unit of electricity generated. And the reason I say 60 years of use is because that's at least as long as nuclear power plants last, unlike renewables, which have approximate 20-year lifespans. And at the end of those lifespans must be recycled as hazardous waste in the case of solar cells, or chopped up and buried in the case of windmills. Let's figure it on the same lifetime as nuclear power. I will quit here and continue later on. Thank you.
Let's go ahead and do whatever we can to have a group discussion on how viable are the non-greenhouse gas alternatives for producing materials such as cement, steel, plastics, and fertilizer.
Cement is a real problem because of what I said. Essentially, you have to melt rock. I mean, cement is, and this is cement. Cement is different from concrete, right? Cement is actually the powdered lime mixed with sand and a little bit of clay. And you have to melt all of those. They completely combine. So you need to be up around 1800 to 2000 degrees centigrade. So over 3000 degrees Fahrenheit. And as of now, the ability to do that using electric heating is very expensive, is not commercial. Now for steel, that's changing very quickly. Believe it or not, it actually requires less of a high temperature. Sweden makes a fair bit of steel, and Norway makes some as well, to use electric heating, electrothermal pyroelectricity to generate that. Plastics are a big problem, but now there's such a push for them, and there are a number of companies in Europe particularly that are competing against each other with new methods to bring plastics back to their original hydrocarbon composition, to grind them up and to heat them and to separate out the hydrogen and the carbon and recombine them and remove the dyes and other material that's put into them. This doesn't seem commercial entirely yet, and it is at a new phase, but essentially that would mean that a lot more than 9%, which is the common figure used today, of recycling would be a lot more than that, would be possible by the end of even this decade. In terms of the last one, fertilizer, that can be replaced using vegetable material, but that's not commercial yet. Most fertilizer is made by breaking apart natural gas and generating ammonia at high temperatures and with a catalyst. There is progress being made, but these are all happening at different rates, and they seem to have different possibilities. Mr. Gates is entirely correct that cement seems to be the largest challenge. He's also correct in saying that more than half the world's cement comes out of China. And so what he does not mention, and what I would emphasize, is that that's politics. That's where political realities come in. And that's what he misses a great deal of in his book. He doesn't see that there's no such thing as energy without politics.
I have a bit of a problem with the definition or how this question is stated. They talk about non-greenhouse gas alternatives. Well, does that include wind and solar? If it does, that ignores the immense amount of pollution and carbon dioxide emitted during the mining of the immense amounts of materials these two alternative need, and the fact that you have to replace them or at least rebuild them 3 times during the life of a nuclear reactor. I think that needs definition, and I think we want to be careful what we're comparing, because in none of these categories can wind and solar compete with nuclear for other reasons besides the ones I've mentioned.
How would the proposal for long-distance transmission of intermittent energy affect the electricity grid?
In shorting the grid, I point out that there are 3 ways that a grid becomes fragile. One is that it overly depends on renewables, because intermittent renewables turn on and off when they want to. Then it overly depends on natural gas to back up the renewables. The trouble with natural gas is it's just-in-time delivery. So if anything goes wrong, it isn't there. It's not like nuclear or coal where the fuel is stored on site. And the third way I think a grid gets fragile is depending on importing electricity, because there are so many reasons where you won't be able to import it when you want to. For example, in winter up here, we think, oh, well, we've got deals with Hydro-Quebec, and we'll get all this energy down from Hydro-Quebec. But unfortunately, when it's really cold and we really want that, Hydro-Quebec doesn't send it, because they have agreed to send us only half the amount of energy they usually send as a constant thing. The amount they usually send, they keep half of it for themselves. When the temperature is 30 below here and 30 below there, not going to happen. The same thing happened in Texas recently. Texas was having terrible rolling blackouts, and everybody says, well, if Texas had been connected to the local grids, they were having rolling blackouts. They weren't going to send anything to Texas. So anyway, I can go on and on about some other issues with transmission, but time is short and I've talked long enough.
Okay, so we have a few presenters, and we have Cascadia Climate Action. We have Lily Stanton.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lily. I'm with Cascadia Climate Action, and we are a nonprofit that's based out of Seattle. And our mission is to get our community informed about climate change and involved in taking climate action. And so one of the ways we do that is through a calendar, which you can find on our website. One of the ways we do that is through our calendar, which is on our website, and it's basically we try and put all of these events that organizations hold just around the Pacific Northwest on climate action, so people can find something that fits their schedule and their interests, because we really do believe that everybody can do something for climate action.
Hi, everybody. Greg Hamra. Citizens Climate Lobby, also Business Climate Leaders, which is an action team that I'm a member of. We're a lot of action teams. Real quick show of hands, who has heard of Citizens Climate Lobby? Anybody in this room? Okay. Yeah, I mean, we're huge. We're 200,000 volunteer members around the world, 180,000 in the USA. 92% of congressional districts have a liaison. And everybody on Capitol Hill knows us. And National Geographic covered the work we do a few years ago on the award-winning documentary series, Years of Living Dangerously. So we advocate for bold climate action, policy level, federal policy with global reach, treating global warming as a global issue, not a US issue, not a local or a personal issue, and certainly not trying to substitute footprint fixations. Green your life. There's a lot of reasons to green your life. A quick reminder, I just saw a recent stat in the 5 years since the Paris Agreement, 60 of the world's largest banks loaned $3.8 trillion to fossil fuel companies for exploration, extraction, and combustion. By you and me, legally, by the books, breaking no laws, simply following the rules. If you don't see that as a problem, a systemic problem that needs to be fixed, then you don't understand the problem. And I like to quote G.K. Chesterton. It's not that they don't have the solutions, like the poster behind me in Drawdown, it's they don't know the problem. They don't understand the problem. And the problem is that we're not going to achieve any scale of these solutions or a drawdown of emissions without shifting capital away from dirty energy.
Let's talk about labor with Lorenzo. Thanks so much, Greg.
First of all, let me say that this has been a wonderful forum. I'm learning a lot. I have to be upfront that the environment is not my main issue, but it's my main existential issue, because I understand very well that if this is not taken care of, we are not going to be around for too long. So it's a very important issue right off the bat. Our organization has an environmental committee headed by Gabe Ignetti, and we are basically helping to educate the community on these issues. So.
And thanks for bringing us this perspective. And so we're going to have the moderated session.
Partial reductions by 2030 could set us on the wrong path. I think for me that was worth the price of the book. Yeah. I mean, that was just something nobody ever says. Now, I understand if you're running for office, you want to have something to show by the next election. But most of us aren't running for office. And most of us would be quite happy to see things moving forward in a way that is sustainable, as opposed to locking in a lot of natural gas and so forth. And I felt very strongly about him not understanding the institutional issues. Now, if you look at it a different way, you can say he doesn't understand the institutional issues, or you can say he's doing an amazing thought experiment about how we could do it. And he doesn't know if this would actually work. The trouble is that I see so many thought experiments. There's a physical grid, and there's a policy grid, and there's a could grid. We could do this, we could do that, we could make it happen the same. We have enough books on the could grid. We have enough academic papers on the could grid. We have to pay some attention to the policy grid. Robert Bryce, who wrote Power Hungry and the book Juice, How Electricity Explains the World, well, he has a podcast. I've been on the podcast. And he also had Lee Cordner. Basically, Lee has been a reliability and transmission engineer for his whole working life, or for most of it. When someone asked him, how will you get major transmission lines built? He said, well, it's simple. First of all, you got to take away those states' rights. A lot of states just don't want them, and they do things. He says, and after that, you really have to go about the Native Americans. They have vast stretches of land, and they often fight our transmission lines. So you got to do something about them, too. I mean, he was just kidding, of course. He doesn't really think you're going to do this or should do this. But he's trying to say that these are not trivial questions. How are you going to get this transmission line done? It is not something you're just going to go out and do. I think that trying to get something built for a couple of decades can make any person, the sweetest person, into a real cynic. But I will say that we have Hydro-Quebec, and So bringing hydropower from Quebec into Vermont is actually a fairly reasonable thing to do. The thing is that people want to bring hydropower to Boston from Quebec. And Boston isn't right next to Quebec. You have to go through these states to get down to Massachusetts and down to Boston. And it's something about DC lines, the physical grid. They're not like with substations along them that you can put a little power on, take a little power off. And so basically, you're going to put this line through the state, and we're not going to get any of the electricity. It's headed for Boston. Sorry about that, Vermont. Do your own deal. Put in another line. Well, as you can imagine, when I see these ideas of lines stretching across various states in the West, to bring power to some city somewhere, I'm thinking, oh yeah, they're going to love it. It's going to be easy peasy. The markets, that is the, quote, deregulated markets, which actually have more regulation than the old vertically integrated utilities used to have. The markets with their 5-minute auctions have really distorted anything to do with reliability. I mean, it is just dreadful. It used to be there was a utility. You see, when you were facing your PUC would say, we've given you a certain rate of return, but considering the outages you had, considering them, this fine is going to really cut into that rate of return. So don't do that again next year. It's a very bad idea for your stockholders. Well, the thing is that a merchant generator looked at the price of natural gas going up and said, I usually sell to a rural cooperative. They're not going to be able to pay what I have to charge them for this. I'm offline. I'm out of here. Because they don't have an obligation. Nobody's going to sue them for the fact that they found that it was not profitable for them to make electricity, so they decided not to do it for an hour or two until the prices came down. When do the power plants get money in the auctions? When there's a crisis, when the most expensive plant is online burning fancy diesel fuel, and it is setting what's called the clearing price, which is what all the other plants get. Oh my, that's a lovely day. So what you see is that instead of the plants having an obligation to stay online and afraid to be punished with fines, what you actually have is brinksmanship. Brinksmanship pays. And there are so many things I feel that are wrong with the way this thing is going that I can't even begin to tell you. And maybe I should just stop talking, and people probably have questions. I keep talking, I know that.
Hi, Meredith. It's Rick here. Yeah,
Hi, Rick.
I put a couple of points there. One of the problems is that each power type is viewed equally. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah, I can tell you about that. I'll tell you, the story is basically the group that runs the system, the Regional Transmission Organization system, is the group that runs the auctions. And they're supposed to do absolutely everything by auction and never give preference to one kind of power plant over another. Every kilowatt is the same. Unfortunately, every kilowatt is the same for this 5 minutes, and if it's offline next 5 minutes, oh well. So one of the things that happened is in New England, our RTO said, we're headed for some real crises in the winter because we don't have new natural gas lines. So we're going to pay power plants to keep oil on site, because many of the power plants can use both natural gas or oil. So when the power plants can't get natural gas because homes are burning natural gas for warmth, and homes have priority, the idea being you can't just suddenly get another kind of furnace in your home, but the power plant could have been prepared to deal with not getting natural gas. But basically it says, you put it online, I know what I have to pay, and I'll be paying you for every kilowatt hour you put online. They buy at the spot price. So, for example, if I'm a local utility, let's say I'm, Liberty Utilities of, some state, and I own the distribution system in my area. and I'm buying the actual kilowatt hours. And a lot of times this works out to be really good. It turns out to be a good deal. For example, in Texas, the clearing price is often negative, but it is not really a sustainable deal. I mean, no business can stay in business by paying you to take their product.
So, Meredith, question is, how would you reform it if you had to?
Well, there are two possible ways. The first is to throw off the whole RTO auction system. And I think if I could, I would go back to the vertically integrated utilities where the buck stopped on the desk of the guy who ran the utility. And he had to make sure there was enough power and his transmission lines were in good shape, and that he could go to the PUC and say, look, I have enough power, my transmission lines and my distribution system is good shape. I need a certain rate of return. And the PUC would say yes. And that worked pretty darn well for a long time. The other possibility is that you can have different tiers of systems. So, for example, you might have the auction, and it's an auction for power plants that will guarantee they're on all that time between 10 at night and 4 in the morning, and they compete with each other. In other words, you get the baseload plants competing at baseload.
I'm going to bump in right here and thank you so much for your time, Meredith. You have been very generous, and I want to thank you for your time.
So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. So everyone, I'm going to go ahead and say, if you like, we have two other fantastic speakers. I'm going to go to Scott.
Yeah. So here, guys, let me show my last slide here, because this is something I would say to Mr. Gates. This is what we learn in the energy world. The world's coal use is at a plateau just about now, and will probably begin to go down. Coal can be replaced by nuclear, and it really can't be replaced by renewables because of their intermittency. Coal is used as what we call base load, so it's on pretty much steady at the same level 24/7. And nuclear is the same and will be better at that even into the future. So we have real options. Coal is also being replaced by natural gas. That's one of the reasons natural gas is increasing. That's particularly true in Western countries. Gas is also used a great deal in industry. Oil is going up because the world continues to motorize, and because of the demand for petrochemicals, mainly plastics. The demand there is rising in Asia most of all, but it will rise quite rapidly in some of the countries I mentioned before. Coal is the one that we can probably replace the most of near term and midterm and long term. And that's because it's used overwhelmingly, but not exclusively, to generate power. And it has the most alternatives. So gas, and in some places, this isn't appreciated as much as it should be in the West, oil is used to generate electricity. Fuel oil, nasty stuff, very heavily polluting stuff. But all the renewables and hydro and nuclear are all competitors to coal. And renewables will increase. Hydro will most likely increase. Nuclear, we have to hope. And I certainly do. And I believe it will increase. So coal will be going down. Natural gas will continue to increase. And oil demand will, not oil extraction or production or consumption, but oil demand will probably peak within the next 15 years. People are saying within the next 3 or 4 years, but they don't know what they're talking about. This is usually consulting firms. They don't know. I'm sorry to say, but they really don't know. So don't listen to that.
Like they've been saying we're at peak oil forever, haven't they?
Yes, well, peak oil is a fantasy. It always was a fantasy, and it always will be a fantasy. The world has so much more oil and gas than we ever thought, and the fracking or the shale revolution has released that. Technology has proven peak oil to be a complete myth. And this news arrives at exactly the wrong time.
What would you have to say about these nuclear plants in the United States just closing down, being replaced by gas? Isn't that directly walking backwards?
Yes, absolutely. And not just by baby steps either. Germany, what a sad thing. They have some of the best engineers in the world. Their nuclear plants are working at over 100% efficiency. It's amazing. And they're going to shut these things down. I mean, I understand it's in their political DNA. I do understand, but I don't understand. I mean, it makes no sense. It makes no sense. And they have a huge, very powerful coal lobby, the unions. And it's one of the reasons why the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, this new pipeline bringing more gas from Russia, that's one of the reasons that the Christian Democrats by Angela Merkel want that pipeline so they can reduce their emissions more rapidly. It's very messy in Germany. And boy, they could do a lot better with their nuclear, but...
How's it going, Scott? How are you?
Good, I'm fine. How are you, Bob?
All right. Can you hear me?
Fire away. Yeah.
How do you think we're going to fix the fossil fuel industry? How's America going to work that out, huh?
How we're going to fix the... Well, which problem do you want to fix first? They're going to fix themselves to a certain degree. Shell and BP see their long-term futures as very different. They are not fools, and they know that oil and natural gas are going to be used for decades ahead, and they're still going to be used at significant levels at 2050. But they see themselves now as energy companies. So Shell has an entire plan that it's brought before its shareholders this week to vote on whether they're going to become a kind of middleman, a kind of distributor of electricity from various sources, renewable sources, nuclear sources, potentially fossil fuel sources with carbon capture. They're going to be kind of dealing with the customers directly. They see themselves as being an energy distributor this way.
Demographically, everybody, including Bill Gates, is assuming that we roll up to somewhere around 9 billion as women become more educated, people become more prosperous. It happened in Bangladesh, the birth rate went down. Some of the other African nations, particularly, I'm seeing Nigerian economics ministers with PhDs and 6 kids. Are we sure that the demographic brakes are actually going to come on? Are we seeing a slowdown in other nations as the women become more educated?
Not everywhere. No, it's definitely not a one-size suit or, dress or shorts fits everyone. No. And as you educate women and as you modernize, by the last decade, 2.5 decades probably of this century, Africa will be the most populous area in the world, and its population will still be increasing, but at a much lower rate. These are the forecasts. The United Nations Population Division has several different scenarios. It no longer sees 9 billion any longer as the mean. It's looking at 10 billion. And then it has one for 12 billion because now it's more complex. So we don't really know if modernization is going to make population peak in this century. That seemed certain. But like Yogi Berra said, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future.
All right, everyone, thank you so much